Imagine a country the morning after independence. The new flag goes up, the anthem plays, and the ore still leaves for refining overseas. The same wealth moving in the same direction under a different banner. That picture is Fanon's, and one explanation I want to push against says it doesn't matter much, that the new nations won their freedom and then squandered it because they weren't ready. But in a book published in 1961, as decolonization was surging across Africa, Fanon had written down the machinery he could already watch assembling, the way independence gets captured, and by whom. Fanon wrote, quote, "The national bourgeoisie in the underdeveloped countries is not geared to production, invention, creation, or work," end quote. That word, bourgeoisie, just means the propertied, educated class. He was naming the class he expected to inherit the new states, one he saw as built to broker rather than to build. His is only one cause among several, but he flips the first question you ask. When a formerly colonized country stumbles, the reflex is to ask what was wrong with its people. Fanon makes you ask what was wrong with the structure they inherited, and who was standing there to run it. Was the betrayal of people who weren't ready, or a machine he could already watch being built? We go through the revolt that had the power and no plan, the class that walked into the colonizer's shoes, and what Fanon proposed instead, along with the places his own answer strains. The trap gets set one chapter before the betrayal. The shorthand version of Fanon I was handed is the apostle of violence, the man who told the colonized to kill and meant little more. But in these pages, he's the romantic of the uprising, who then turns on his own romance. He watches the countryside rise, and in his account, the rural masses are the one force that revolts on its own, while the party's men in the cities keep the lid on. And then he names the ceiling on that power. Fanon wrote, quote, "Racism, hatred, resentment, and the legitimate desire for revenge alone cannot nurture a war of liberation," end quote. He puts that last phrase, the legitimate desire for revenge, in his own quotation marks. He isn't calling the rage wrong. He's saying rage is not a plan. It can light the fire, and it cannot run the house that's left standing in the morning. Pure spontaneity, he says, cannot hold up as a doctrine on its own. A critic could answer that a revolt doesn't need a finished plan for governing to be worth having. Fair enough. My read of Fanon is that the trouble comes later. A victory with no answer for the next morning leaves an opening for whoever walked in prepared, which is the whole question the second the colonizer's flag comes down. Who is standing there, ready to take the empty chair? Fanon's answer is the engine of the book. He doesn't stop at the departing colonizer. He asks, who takes over the colonial economy once the flag is changed? The ones who step forward are what he calls the national bourgeoisie, and he sees them as brokers, not builders. Fanon wrote, quote, "The national bourgeoisie discovers its historical mission as intermediary," end quote. An intermediary, not owner, not founder, a middleman. He says it comes to serve as a conveyor belt for capitalism, and that phrase is his. Here is the picture. The raw materials keep flowing out to the old buyers, and now a local elite takes its cut for standing in the door. Fanon even strips the shine off the word nationalization, calling it barely more than moving the colonizer's privileges into local hands. Here's the strain the diagnosis has to carry, and it's the fairest objection to him. An intermediary class can also, sometimes, turn and build. It can put that leverage to work at home instead of skimming the exports off the top. In this diagnosis, Fanon leaves it little room for that, and his sharpest claim is his most exposed right there. Hold that thought, because a real country cashes it in at the end. For now, A class that can't earn power by producing has to find another way to keep it. It reaches for three things, and I read each as a substitute for the economic legitimacy the class doesn't have. The first is the ugliest and the fastest. When you can't hand the crowd prosperity, you can hand it someone to blame. Fanon's catalog is ultra-nationalism, chauvinism, and racism. In his example from the Ivory Coast, that racism turns into scapegoating. There are riots aimed at the Dahomians and the Upper Voltans, the very people who ran much of the local business. Their shops are burned. The call goes up for the foreigners to leave. His own label for it is a racism based on fear. My gloss is that the fear belongs to a class with nothing to offer but an enemy. The second thing it reaches for is the single party. I read Fanon as treating the single party not as the betrayal of a noble idea, but as the natural shape of a class with no ground under it, a way to shut down an argument you can't win on results. Fanon wrote, quote, "The single party is the modern form of the bourgeois dictatorship," end quote. And the third is a man. In his account, the leader who once carried a whole people's hopes turns into what Fanon calls the CEO of the company of profiteers. The state fills with his family and his region, and the government candidate comes back with 99% of the votes. And this wasn't only on paper. Ghana had been independent since 1957, its politics tightening through the early 60s, and by 1964, the amendments made the ruling party the only legal one. Fanon isn't forecasting a settled record. He's naming a risk taking shape in the first years of decolonization. The comfortable reading, the one I'm testing, is that Fanon saw the disease, so surely Fanon wrote the cure. The chapter won't quite sign off on it. Look at what he prescribes. Political education instead of slogans. Power pushed out of the capital and spread as widely as it can go. Leaders who, in his words, should flee the capital like the plague. One part of his alternative compresses into something close to a proverb. Fanon wrote, quote, "The land belongs to those who work it," end quote. He is not blind to the risk. The safeguards make sense precisely because the chapter is preoccupied with parties swallowing states. But the tension I can't smooth over is this. The cure still runs through a party, still led by a revolutionary elite. And the thing he just diagnosed was a party and an elite closing around the state. In the passages I've read, he prescribes those safeguards more clearly than he shows they work. Everything hangs on a safeguard he describes, but never really tests. So where I land is a reading you can argue with, not a ruling. The betrayal of the new nations, as I read Fanon, wasn't mostly a people who weren't ready to be free. It was a capture he named while it was still forming, a class whose power came from its position, holding on to it with scapegoats, the single party and the strong man. The book's hardest sentence is also its most dangerous. Fanon wrote, quote, "It must be resolutely opposed because literally it serves no purpose," end quote. His target is a class role, not the worth of every person inside it. But a line like that can come loose from its limit, and a class you can't prove is useless is a class it's easy to call useless anyway. And the empirical doubt is bigger still. If those failures track the Cold War, debt, and commodity crashes more than they track a broker class, then Fanon isn't the main story. And I'll be straight, this episode can't settle that. The honest test is a comparison I haven't run. Countries hit by the same shock, some with a thick class of middlemen and some without, to see which one the collapse follows. I can name the test. I can't hand you the result. And remember the objection from earlier, that an intermediary class can also turn and build. Botswana is what that looks like when it comes true. Its ruling party held a majority for 58 years, from independence in 1966 to 2024. But inside real multi-party elections, and the state took an unusually large public share of the diamond wealth instead of leaving it to a broker class. It complicates Fanon without refuting him. So I lean to his diagnosis, and I hold the word prophecy loosely. What I can't shake is the shape of the thing. The sharpest warning about elite capture in the whole literature of decolonization ends by handing the keys to one more elite.